Strange how a civilization so powerful it could bring down a rival empire and sign the world's first recorded peace treaty could simply vanish from human memory. It's even stranger that for over 2,000 years, their very existence was a historical footnote, a fleeting mention in ancient texts that many scholars believed were simply mythical. Imagine an entire people, a kingdom of warriors and scribes who once ruled a vast swathe of what we now call Turkey and northern Syria, completely erased from history. We live in a world where we can track a package in real time, but for centuries, we couldn't track down an entire empire. And even more bizarre, the people who founded this incredible empire were not the first inhabitants of the land they ruled. They arrived there, a foreign people speaking a foreign language, and simply took over, adopting and adapting the culture of the people already there. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're tucked in and ready to drift off, let me know where you are in the comments and what time it is for you. Maybe someone in Australia is waking up right as you're falling asleep here in America. It's a strange world, isn't it? This story begins not with them, but with the people they displaced. They called themselves the Hatti, and their land, the land of Hatti, was a place of fertile valleys and harsh mountains in central Anatolia, a peninsula that juts out into the Mediterranean and Black Seas. The Hatti were an indigenous people, speaking a language unrelated to any known tongue, and their culture was a patchwork of local traditions. We've found their city-states, their humble little kingdoms, but their story is largely written in the footnotes of another's rise. Into this world of 100 tiny kingdoms, a new Indo-European speaking people began to trickle in from the east, a nomadic or semi-nomadic group who moved with the seasons and the herds. We don't know why they came. Maybe their old land grew cold. Perhaps they were driven out by a rival tribe. It's a mystery lost to the wind, but they came, and they saw, and they stayed. And these new arrivals, speaking a language completely different from the Hatti, began to mix with the locals. They were the Proto-Hittites, and their story starts not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet seep into the existing social fabric. They learned from the Hatti, adopting their gods, their rituals, and even their place names. Over generations, the two cultures blended like water and wine, until it became difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. Historians still argue about the exact nature of this cultural assimilation, whether it was a peaceful integration or a more forceful takeover. But what is certain is that the newcomers were ambitious and they were organized. They began to consolidate their power, forming larger and larger polities, building on the foundations of the Hatti city-states. The oldest record of one of these early rulers is a rather dramatic one, written on a dagger unearthed in the ruins of the city of Ganesh. On this dagger, an early king named Anita, who lived around 1750 BCE, proudly proclaims that he has taken control of his father's kingdom and conquered the surrounding lands. The inscription is a wonderful piece of self-aggrandizement, a classic case of, "I'm a big deal, and I just want you to know it." He boasts of sacking cities, and even goes so far as to lay a curse on anyone who would dare to rebuild the city of Hattusa, which he had leveled. This city, Hattusa, was not yet the Hittite capital we know it as today. It was a Hatti city-state, and Anita, an early Hittite king, was more than happy to see it burn. But what he didn't know couldn't possibly have known was that a future king, a descendant of his, or perhaps just a man who saw an opportunity, would ignore his curse and make that very same city the heart of a powerful empire. Anita's proclamation is a snapshot of a volatile time, a world of warring city-states and ambitious rulers, all of them vying for control. This wasn't a unified empire yet. It was a collection of petty kingdoms, all of them fighting like toddlers over a single toy. One of the first kings we can reliably call a Hittite king, Labana, who came a generation or two after Anita, is credited with really getting the ball rolling on this whole empire thing. He was the first to take the title Great King, and his name became synonymous with the ideal of a powerful, unifying ruler. We don't know much about his specific military campaigns, but we know he was successful. So successful, in fact, that later kings would take his name as a throne name, a tradition similar to the Roman emperors taking the name Caesar. It's a nice little ego boost for a guy who just wanted to be remembered. And remember, these aren't just kings in robes on thrones. These were warrior kings leading their men in person. The air would be thick with dust and the smell of sweat and leather, the clatter of bronze on bronze, the shouts of men, the thud of a spear into a shield. They were building their kingdom with their own two hands, or at least with the hands of their soldiers. And so the old Hittite kingdom was born, a collection of city-states now under a single ruler. But this new kingdom was still fragile, still prone to the internal squabbles that had plagued the Hatti before them. There was no clear line of succession, and when a king died, his sons, his brothers, and his nephews would often fall into a bloody civil war to see who would sit on the throne next. It was a bit like a game of musical chairs, but the loser didn't just stand there awkwardly. He usually ended up with a dagger in his back. This instability was the biggest weakness of the early kingdom, and it would nearly tear them apart before it was finally addressed. But for now, they were ascendant. They were a new power in Anatolia, a group of people who had come from somewhere else, adopted a new home, and were now shaping it in their own image. They had a capital city, Hattusa, cursed by a long-dead king, but now thriving, and a new identity. They were the Hittites, and their story was just beginning. After King Labana had his big moment, and the Hittite Old Kingdom was more or less established, a new ruler came to power, a man named Hattusili Fums. This guy was a real piece of work, a conqueror in the classic sense. He didn't just want to rule a bunch of tiny Anatolian kingdoms. He wanted to expand, to take on the big boys in Syria. He wasn't interested in being a local celebrity. He wanted to be an international superstar. So he packed up his army and headed south, leaving the familiar mountains and plateaus of Anatolia for the dusty plains and bustling trade cities of northern Syria. He sacked cities like Alalach and Urshu, places that were powerful in their own right, and a real nuisance to anyone trying to control the trade routes. The Hittite army wasn't some kind of magical fighting force. They were tough, well-trained, and they knew how to use their chariots, which were becoming an increasingly important part of warfare. They were also surprisingly good at siege warfare, a skill that required a lot of patience and engineering know-how. Two things you don't usually associate with a bunch of brutes. Hattusili's campaigns were brutal but effective. He wasn't just conquering territory. He was establishing a reputation that said, "Don't mess with us." But a reputation is only as good as the person who holds it. And Hattusili Thuan's later years were filled with all the drama and backstabbing of a modern-day reality TV show. He was growing old and needed to name a successor, and this is where things got messy. He originally chose his nephew, Labana, who, spoiler alert, turned out to be a bit of a disappointment. According to Hattusili himself, in a speech recorded on a clay tablet, his nephew was ungrateful, a liar, and a generally terrible person. He went on to say, with all the frustration of a grandfather who just found out his grandson used the good china for finger painting, that this Labana had no respect and was basically a waste of space. So what did a king do when his chosen successor was a dud? He disinherited him, of course. He cast him out and chose a new successor, his grandson, Mursili. And not just any grandson, but a young, possibly still teenage, Mursili. A young man who probably spent his days playing with toy swords and dreaming of being a warrior. And now, suddenly, he was next in line for the throne. It's a good reminder that political intrigue and family drama are not just a modern invention. We think we have it tough at Thanksgiving dinner, but imagine having your inheritance revoked and being banished from the kingdom, all because your grandpa thought you were a disrespectful brat. The new king, Mursili II, took the throne after his grandfather's death, and he inherited not just a kingdom, but a legacy of ambition. His grandfather had pointed south towards the rich lands of Syria and Mesopotamia, and Mursili wasn't about to back down. He continued his grandfather's work, consolidating power and preparing for his own grand campaign. But Mursili had a different target in mind, a target that was bigger, more prestigious, and much, much further away than anything his grandfather had attempted. He set his sights on Babylon. Yes, that Babylon, the legendary city on the Euphrates River, the center of an empire, a place that was, for all intents and purposes, the New York City of the ancient world. Why would he do such a thing? Babylon was hundreds of miles away, a long and dangerous journey through hostile territory. It was an audacious plan, a wild gamble. Maybe he was trying to prove something to himself. Maybe he was trying to outdo his grandfather. Maybe he just really hated Babylon. We don't know for sure, and historians still debate the real motives behind this strange campaign. But what we do know is that he did it. He led his army, his chariots rumbling across the dusty landscape, his soldiers' sandals kicking up clouds of dirt, on a long, long march to a city that had no real connection to the Hittite world. And what happened when he got there? He sacked it. He sacked the great city of Babylon in 1595 BCE, an event that even today sounds unbelievable. We have a Hittite chronicle that describes the event, a triumphant record of Mursili's victory. He plundered the city, taking its treasures, and most importantly, he captured the statue of the god Marduk, the patron god of Babylon. This wasn't just a simple act of theft. It was a powerful symbolic gesture. By taking the god, he was, in a way, taking the city's very soul, its divine protector. The people of Babylon were left without their god and without their king. The Kassite people, a group who had been living in the Babylonian hinterlands for years, saw their opportunity and took control of the city almost immediately after Mursili left. It's a funny twist of fate. The Hittites came, they conquered, they left, and in their wake, they created a power vacuum that another group eagerly filled. Mursili's campaign, for all its glory, was a bit like breaking into your neighbor's house, stealing their TV, and then leaving the door wide open for someone else to move in. He had proven his point, but at a huge cost. He had marched his army to the ends of the known world, and now he had to march them all the way back home. And that's when his luck ran out. Mursili, its grand but ultimately pointless march back from Babylon was a long and exhausting one. His army was laden with plunder, their spirits high from the victory, but they were also vulnerable. And as they made their way back to the familiar hills of Anatolia, they didn't realize they were walking into a different kind of danger. The Hittite court, back in the capital of Hattusa, was a hotbed of intrigue and resentment. While Mursili was away playing a conqueror, his brother-in-law, a man named Hantili, had been stewing in a cocktail of ambition and jealousy. He was the kind of person who smiled to your face while holding a dagger behind his back, and he saw Mursili's extended absence as the perfect opportunity. We can imagine Mursili, tired but proud, finally returning home, only to be met not with a hero's welcome, but with a cold, calculating plot. Hantili, along with some of his co-conspirators, assassinated Mursili shortly after his return. It was a brutal, swift end for a king who had just achieved what no other Hittite king had before him. He had sacked Babylon, a city of immense power and prestige, and his reward was a knife in the dark. It's a classic lesson in ancient politics. You can conquer the world, but your biggest threat is always going to be the guy you're eating dinner with. Hantili's betrayal plunged the Hittite kingdom into what historians refer to as the Dark Age. The name is a bit of a misnomer, as it wasn't a time of total darkness, but it was certainly a time of darkness for the Hittite state. For over a century, the kingdom was a mess of internal conflict, a vicious cycle of assassinations, coups, and civil wars. The throne became a revolving door, with kings taking power only to be overthrown a few years later by a vengeful relative or a power-hungry rival. It was a messy, bloody business. King Hantili himself didn't get to enjoy his ill-gotten gains for very long. He was assassinated by his own son-in-law, Siddhartha the Fun, who in turn was assassinated by his own son. It was a real, "I'll show you," kind of family dynamic, where the ultimate form of rebellion was a fatal stab in the back. This constant political instability crippled the kingdom. The grand ambitions of Labana and Hattusili Yafo were put on hold. The Hittites could no longer project their power outwards because they were too busy fighting each other. Their neighbors, seeing this internal chaos, took advantage of the situation. They began to chip away at the Hittite borders, raiding their territories and reclaiming lands that the Hittites had conquered during their more powerful days. The Hittites were losing not just land, but their identity as a dominant power. Their military, once a source of pride, was now a tool for infighting, a pawn in a larger Game of Thrones. We can imagine the soldiers, veterans of foreign wars, now being forced to fight their countrymen, their morale plummeting with each new assassination. The great city of Hattusa, once the jewel of the kingdom, must have been a place of constant anxiety and fear, a place where a whisper in the wrong ear could get you killed. The records from this period are sparse, which is a big part of why it's called the Dark Age. The scribes, who were busy documenting the glorious reigns of kings before and after this period, were probably too afraid to write anything down that might get them on the wrong side of the next ruler. It's a very pragmatic response to a dangerous situation. If you don't write anything down, you can't be accused of treason. So we are left with a lot of gaps, a lot of unknowns, a lot of missing pieces in the historical puzzle. We know the names of some of the kings, but we know very little about what they actually did. besides getting killed. It was a true low point for the Hittites, a time when their very survival was in question. This period of turmoil wasn't just a political problem, it was a cultural one as well. The Hittite people, who had been building a new unified identity, were now being pulled apart by these endless civil wars. The old Hatti traditions and the new Hittite ones, which had been so beautifully blended together, were now being used as a wedge to divide the population. Loyalties were no longer to the kingdom, but to a specific faction or a specific claimant to the throne. The idea of a strong, unified Hittite state was fading, replaced by 100 different petty loyalties. The kingdom was on a path to self-destruction, and it seemed like there was no one who could stop the downward spiral. It's a sad and sobering story, a testament to how quickly a great power can fall apart from the inside. They had defeated a foreign empire, but they were being defeated by themselves. The glory of Babylon was a distant memory, a faint echo of a time when the Hittites were a force to be reckoned with. Now, they were just another small, insignificant kingdom on the Anatolian plateau, a place where ambitious men were more likely to die in a palace than on a battlefield. The Hittite Dark Age, with its endless cycle of backstabbing and regicide, finally began to see a glimmer of light with the accession of King Telepinu. This guy was a total game changer. He came to power sometime around the mid-16th century BCE, a period when the Hittite kingdom was at its absolute lowest ebb. The kingdom was a mess, the borders were shrinking, and the royal family was more of a murder-suicide pact than a ruling dynasty. Telepinu looked at this situation and decided quite rightly that something needed to be done. He didn't just want to be another king who got a dagger in his back. He wanted to be the king who finally fixed the problem, and his solution was both brilliant and breathtakingly simple. He wrote a law. This wasn't just any law. It was a royal edict, a formal decree that would change the very nature of Hittite succession and hopefully stop the bleeding once and for all. This edict, known to us as the Edict of Telepinu, is one of the most important documents to have ever come out of the Hittite world. It's a bit like a constitution for a kingdom that was tired of killing itself. The Edict of Telepinu was a masterpiece of political pragmatism. It laid out a clear, unambiguous line of succession, something the Hittites had been sorely lacking. The rule was simple. The king's primary heir would be his eldest son, born to his first wife. If there was no son, then the eldest daughter would be married to a man who would become king. This was a radical change from the previous system, where the king could just pick his favorite son, his nephew, or even his brother. A system that was, as we've already seen, a complete and utter disaster. This new system was designed to stop the endless feuding and fighting among the royal family. It took the power of succession out of the king's hands and put it into a set of written rules. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were still loopholes and ways to exploit the system, but it was a massive improvement. It was a step towards a more stable, more predictable form of government. It also served as a bit of a historical document, as Telepinu used it to recount the tragic history of the kingdom, all the assassinations and betrayals, as a cautionary tale to future generations. It was as if he was saying, "Look at what happens when you let family drama take over. Don't do that." But Telepinu wasn't just a lawmaker. He was also a politician who knew how to make friends and influence people. He didn't just write the edict and hope for the best. He also sought to heal the divisions that had torn the kingdom apart. He held public assemblies, or banquets, where he would address the people and the nobility, reminding them of their shared history and their shared fate. He understood that a kingdom divided could not stand. He also made a point of not executing his political opponents, something that was a bit of a novelty in a kingdom that had a penchant for regicide. Instead, he would often exile them or simply strip them of their power. This was a surprisingly merciful approach for a monarch of his time, and it was a sign that he was thinking about the long-term stability of the kingdom, not just his own short-term survival. He wanted to build a kingdom that would last, not one that would collapse the moment he died. The Edict of Telepinu, for all its good intentions, wasn't a silver bullet. The kingdom was still weak, still vulnerable. It was a long, slow climb back to power. The decades following Telepinu's reign are still a bit of a black box for us, a period where the historical record is once again a bit thin. We know the Hittites were still fighting with their neighbors, still trying to reclaim lost territories. But there's a sense that the worst was over. The internal political chaos had been, if not completely eliminated, at least tamed. The succession was more or less clear, and the kings who followed Telepinu were able to focus on external threats rather than internal ones. This was a crucial shift, a turning point in Hittite history. The kingdom was no longer a drowning man, flailing desperately in the water. It was a man, soaked and exhausted, finally able to grab hold of the side of the boat. It would still take time to climb back in, but at least he wasn't sinking anymore. The Hittite kingdom was not yet the great empire it would become, but it was on its way. The foundation had been laid, the rules had been written, and the stage was set for the next, more glorious act of their history. The stage was set for the rise of a new breed of Hittite kings, men who would finally take the lessons of the past to heart and build a true, lasting empire. And it would start with a king whose name, unfortunately, we don't know for sure. A king who ushered in a new era of expansion and consolidation. With the Edict of Telepinu successfully halting the kingdom's self-destructive tendencies, the Hittites finally had a chance to breathe and look outwards again. This period, often called the Middle Kingdom, was a time of rebuilding and quiet consolidation. The constant palace intrigue was now a dull, persistent hum instead of a deafening roar. Kings were still being kings, but now they had a clear set of rules to follow, or at least a powerful precedent to consider. This stability allowed them to start thinking about things other than who was going to stab them next. They began to rebuild their military, to fortify their borders, and to cautiously re-engage with their neighbors. It was a slow, deliberate process, like a patient recovering from a long illness. They weren't quite ready to go on a conquest spree, but they were no longer a pushover either. The kingdom was regaining its strength, its confidence, and just as a plant needs a strong root system to grow tall, the Hittite kingdom needed this period of quiet growth before it could blossom into a full-fledged empire. The Hittite kings of this era began to assert their authority in Anatolia once more. They led military campaigns to secure their borders, particularly in the mountainous regions to the north and east, where rebellious tribes were always a thorn in their side. These campaigns were less about grand conquest and more about making a point that the Hittites were back and they were not to be trifled with. They were reclaiming their title as the dominant power in the region, a title they had lost during the Dark Age. We can imagine the soldiers, their morale slowly returning, the armor gleaming in the sun, marching through the Anatolian plains. The sound of their footsteps was no longer the sound of a desperate retreat, but the sound of a confident, resurgent power. This period saw the Hittites' sphere of influence slowly expanding. They began to forge alliances with smaller city-states and to exert a kind of soft power, using diplomacy and trade to secure their position. In addition to the occasional sword, it was a more sophisticated approach than the smash-and-grab tactics of Anita and Mursili. They were learning to play the long game. This period of consolidation was crucial because a new player was emerging on the world stage, a rival that would eventually become the Hittites' greatest adversary. To their east, in northern Mesopotamia, the kingdom of Mitanni was becoming a force to be reckoned with. The Mitanni were a Hurrian-speaking people who had established a powerful and well-organized state. They were a bit like the Hittites' evil twin, but with better chariots. Their kingdom was a crossroads of cultures, blending Mesopotamian, Syrian, and Hurrian traditions, and they controlled a vast and wealthy territory. They were expanding west, right into the areas the Hittites considered their own, particularly in the fertile lands of northern Syria. The stage was being set for a clash of titans, a classic geopolitical standoff between two ambitious and powerful empires. The Hittites, still recovering from their own internal struggles, were not yet ready for a direct confrontation, but they were keeping a close eye on their new rival. They knew a fight was coming. It was just a matter of when, and this is where we see the transition from the Old Kingdom to the New Kingdom, or the Hittite Empire proper. The kings of this era started to refer to themselves with grander titles, reflecting their newfound power. The capital of Hattusa, once cursed and later the scene of so much bloodshed, was now a bustling imperial city filled with palaces, temples, and archives of clay tablets. The Hittites were no longer just a kingdom. They were an empire. The change wasn't a sudden one. It was a gradual evolution, a slow build-up of power and confidence. But there's a moment, an event, that we can point to as the real beginning of the Hittite Empire. A king named Tudalia, or Don, depending on which historian you ask. It gets a little confusing with all the numbered kings, came to the throne and began a series of ambitious military campaigns that were different in scale and scope from anything that had come before. He wasn't just securing borders, he was expanding them. He marched east towards the Mitanni border and west into the lands of the Azawa kingdom. He was a man with a vision of a truly great Hittite empire, one that would stretch from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates River. This new, aggressive policy was a clear signal to the rest of the world. The Hittites were back, and they meant business. The long, dark night of the Old Kingdom was finally over. The Edict of Telepinu had done its job, and the Hittite state, now stable and unified, was ready to take on the world. The stage was set for the next great chapter of their history, a chapter filled with legendary battles, diplomatic intrigues, and the rise of one of the greatest kings the Near East had ever seen. The Hittites were no longer a footnote in the history of the Hatti people. They were a power in their own right, a true empire with a destiny to fulfill. As the Hittite kingdom solidified its position and began to transition into a full-fledged empire, the stage was set for a major showdown. To the east lay the Mitanni kingdom, a state that had grown powerful during the Hittites' period of internal strife. They had spent the last century building their own little empire, and now they controlled a vast amount of territory in northern Mesopotamia and Syria. The Mitanni were particularly good at using their chariots in warfare, a skill they had refined to a devastating degree. Their elite chariot warriors, called the Marianu, were a force to be reckoned with, and their kingdom was rich and well organized. They had been expanding westward for a while, and now they were bumping up against the newly resurgent Hittites in the exact same region of northern Syria that Hattusili I had fought in all those years ago. The air was thick with tension, a silent gathering storm between two great powers. This rivalry wasn't just a simple border dispute. It was a battle for control of one of the most important geopolitical regions in the ancient world. Northern Syria was a crossroads of trade, a place where goods and ideas flowed between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. The Hittites wanted to control it because it was a source of wealth and a buffer against their eastern rivals. The Mitanni wanted it for the same reasons. The two empires were like two stubborn teenagers fighting over the remote control. Neither was willing to give an inch. This geopolitical rivalry played out in a series of proxy wars, with the Hittites and Mitanni both supporting different local city-states in the region. One city, Aleppo, was a constant point of contention. The Hittites would support one king, and the Mitanni would support another, turning the whole region into a kind of ancient chessboard where the pieces were made of flesh and blood. It was a messy, complicated, and utterly brutal struggle for dominance. The early clashes between the two empires were a mixed bag for the Hittites. They didn't always win. The Mitanni were a powerful and well-established empire, and their military was at the top of its game. The Hittites were still finding their footing, still shaking off the rust from their long period of internal conflict. But with each skirmish, with each battle, the Hittites were learning. They were adapting their tactics, refining their strategies, and building a more professional and effective army. They were like a boxer who had been out of the ring for a decade and was now slowly getting back into shape, taking a few hits, but learning with every punch. This period was a crucial training ground for the Hittite military, a trial by fire that would prepare them for the next great phase of their history. It was a time of growth and development, a period where they were forged into the empire we would come to know. This long-running rivalry between the Hittites and Mitanni also had a profound effect on the region's smaller states. They were caught in the middle, a bit like a small boat in a stormy sea. They had to choose a side, and choosing the wrong side could mean complete annihilation. Some chose to align with the Mitanni, hoping for protection, while others cast their lot with the Hittites. It created a complex web of alliances and betrayals, a geopolitical drama that would make for a great TV show if only we had more surviving clay tablets. The shifting allegiances of these small city-states are a testament to the power and influence of these two great empires. They weren't just fighting each other, they were shaping the entire political landscape of the Near East. The struggle with Mitanni was so significant that it began to influence Hittite foreign policy for decades. The very existence of the Mitanni Empire forced the Hittites to become a more aggressive, more expansionist power. They couldn't just sit back and be a regional power in Anatolia. They had to actively compete with Mitanni for influence and territory. This competition pushed them to become the empire they were destined to be. It was a classic case of rivalry breeding strength. Without the Mitanni, the Hittites might have remained a smaller, more insular kingdom. But with the Mitanni to their east, they were forced to grow, to adapt, to become a true superpower. And their victory over the Mitanni would not be a single event, but a long, slow campaign of attrition that would finally culminate in the reign of one of the most brilliant military strategists of the ancient world. A man who would finally take the Hittite Empire to its zenith and end the long-running rivalry once and for all. A man whose name would be spoken with both fear and respect. A man who was destined to become a legend. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the great drama of the Hittite-Mitanni rivalry was about to reach its climax. The man who would finally take center stage and resolve this conflict was a king named Suppiluliuma. He wasn't born a king, but rather the son of King Todalia II, or the third, depending on who you ask. Remember how confusing the numbering can be. And he came to power sometime around 1344 BCE. He was a force of nature, a brilliant military strategist, and a ruthless politician. He was the kind of guy who didn't just play the game. He changed the rules. Before him, the Hittite kings had been struggling to keep pace with the Mitanni. After him, the Mitanni would be a historical footnote. Suppiluliuma's reign is so important that historians often refer to it as the beginning of the Hittite Empire proper, a golden age of Hittite power and influence. Suppiluliuma's first big move was to secure the home front. He inherited a kingdom that was still, despite the recent gains, surrounded by a number of hostile or semi-hostile neighbors. The Kaska, a group of unruly tribes living in the mountainous regions to the north, were a constant menace, raiding Hittite territory whenever they got a chance. Suppiluliuma didn't just try to placate them. He went on a series of punishing campaigns, pushing them back and securing his northern borders. This was a crucial step. A good general knows you can't fight a war abroad if your backyard is on fire. He then turned his attention to the west and the kingdom of Azawa, another long-standing rival, and brought them under Hittite control. With his flanks secured, he was finally free to focus on his main target, the Mitanni. But Suppiluliuma didn't just charge in with his chariots blazing. He was a master of diplomacy and subterfuge. He spent years carefully building a network of alliances in northern Syria, wooing local city-states away from their Mitanni overlords. He used a combination of threats and promises, a classic carrot-and-stick approach. He was a charming guy when he wanted to be, but he could also be terrifyingly brutal. And his efforts paid off. He created a coalition of local rulers who were more than happy to turn on their Mitanni masters, especially if it meant a chance to align with a rising power like the Hittites. This was a classic piece of geopolitical maneuvering, a textbook example of how to win a war before a single arrow is fired. The Mitanni were still a powerful empire, but they were now surrounded by a network of Hittite allies, a web of intrigue and betrayal that was slowly suffocating them. Finally, when he was good and ready, Suppiluliuma launched his great campaign against Mitanni. He didn't attack them head-on. Instead, he led his army on a long circuitous route through the rugged eastern Anatolian mountains, a route that would have been incredibly difficult and dangerous. The Mitanni, who were expecting an attack from the west, were completely taken by surprise. Suppiluliuma's army swept down from the north like a thunderclap, conquering the Mitanni capital of Washukani in a single devastating campaign. It was a blitzkrieg, a lightning-fast war that caught his enemies completely off guard. He sacked the city, took its treasures, And most importantly, he captured the Mitanni king and his family, ending the Mitanni Empire's dominance in a single decisive blow. But he didn't destroy them completely. Instead, he installed his own puppet king on the throne, turning the once powerful Mitanni kingdom into a vassal state of the Hittite Empire. It was a brilliant move, a way to control a vast amount of territory without having to station a large army there permanently. Suppiluliuma. Noi's victories changed the entire geopolitical landscape of the Near East. The Hittite Empire was now the undisputed superpower in the region. They controlled Anatolia, a significant chunk of Syria, and now, through their new vassal, they had a strong presence in northern Mesopotamia. But Suppiluliuma's work wasn't done. He was a man who saw opportunities where others saw problems, and he was about to get a very big, very unexpected opportunity from a most surprising source, the court of Egypt. This new diplomatic entanglement would lead to one of the most dramatic and mysterious episodes in Hittite history. A story of love, betrayal, and murder. It would be a testament to Suppiluliuma's growing international prestige, and a sign that the Hittites were now a major player on the world stage, a power that even the mighty Egyptians had to reckon with. Suppiluliuma I, the newly crowned emperor of the Hittites, was a man in his element. He had crushed his rivals, secured his borders, and now held sway over a vast and powerful empire. His court in Hattusa, once a place of fear and intrigue, was now a bustling center of international diplomacy. And it was here in the heart of the Hittite Empire that a very strange and very important piece of mail arrived. It was a letter from a queen, a widow from a foreign land, and it would set in motion a chain of events that would change the course of history. This letter, which is one of the most famous and fascinating documents from the ancient world, is known to us as the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, and it was found in the Hittite royal archives at Hattusa. The queen, whose name is not mentioned in the letter, but is believed by most scholars to be Ankhesenamun, the widow of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, was in a desperate situation. She wrote to Suppiluliuma, a man she had never met, and offered him a deal that was, to put it mildly, a bit wild. She told him that her husband, the pharaoh, was dead, and that she had no son to succeed him. The Egyptian court was in turmoil, and she was being pressured to marry a commoner, a man named A, who was a powerful minister at the court. She didn't want to marry him, and she was afraid of what would happen if she did. So she came up with a bold and almost unthinkable solution. She asked Suppiluliuma to send her one of his sons to be her husband and the new pharaoh of Egypt. Imagine that. An Egyptian queen, a woman from a culture that saw itself as the center of the universe, was asking a foreign king for a husband. It was a stunning reversal of tradition, and a clear sign of the desperation she must have been feeling. She even went so far as to say that she would not marry one of her subjects, but would instead take a husband from a foreign house. She was, in effect, offering the throne of Egypt to a Hittite prince. When Suppiluliuma received this letter, he was, as you can imagine, a bit suspicious. This was an offer that was almost too good to be true. He was a great king, but he was also a cautious one. He didn't want to get played. So he did what any good king would do. He sent a messenger to Egypt to verify the queen's story. He needed to know if she was for real, if her offer was genuine. The Hittite messenger, a man named Hattuwaziti, went to Egypt and spoke with the queen. He returned with a second letter from the queen. a letter that was even more desperate and more insistent than the first. In this second letter, she rebukes Suppiluliuma for his skepticism, saying, "Why do you say they are just trying to deceive me? If I had a son, would I write to a foreign land to my disadvantage and that of my country? They would use him against me, and he would take power for himself." This second letter, with its tone of wounded pride and genuine fear, finally convinced Suppiluliuma that the offer was real. He decided to send one of his sons, a prince named Sananza, to Egypt to marry the queen and become the new pharaoh. The Hittite court must have been buzzing with excitement. One of their own, a young prince, was about to become the most powerful man in the most prestigious kingdom in the world. It was a victory of diplomacy that was almost greater than any military victory. Suppiluliuma had defeated the Mitanni, and now, through the stroke of a pen, he was about to get control of Egypt. But the story, as we'll soon find out, doesn't have a happy ending. The Hittite prince, Sanansa, never made it to Egypt. He was murdered on his way there. We don't know who killed him. It could have been the Egyptians, perhaps the very same nobles who had been trying to force the queen to marry a commoner, or it could have been a third party, a rival kingdom that saw the union of the Hittite and Egyptian empires as a threat. The mystery of Sanansa's death is still debated by scholars today. But what we do know is that the prince's death sent Suppiluliuma into a blind rage. He had been offered the world, and then had it snatched away from him, and his own son was killed in the process. He would not let this go unpunished. His revenge would be swift, and it would be brutal. The quiet diplomacy of the Amarna letters was now over, and a new, more violent chapter in the history of the Hittite Empire was about to begin. The death of Prince Sanansa, murdered on his way to a throne, was a tragedy that would have lasting repercussions. When the news reached Suppiluliuma III, the great Hittite king was, understandably, furious. His son had been killed, and a golden opportunity had been stolen from him. He was a conqueror, a general, a man who had built an empire, and he was not one to let such an insult go unanswered. He declared war on Egypt, an act of sheer, unbridled rage and a massive gamble. The Hittites and Egyptians were two of the world's superpowers, and a war between them would be a global conflict, a struggle that would shake the entire Near East. And the stage for this new war was set once again in northern Syria, the same area that had been the battleground for the Hittite-Mitanni rivalry. Egypt, which had been a dominant force in the region for centuries, now found itself facing a new, more powerful rival. A rival that was angry, ambitious, and ready to fight. Suppiluliuma didn't lead the campaign himself. He was getting on in years, and his health was not what it once was. Instead, he sent his son, Anuwanda, to lead the Hittite army into Syria. This was a war of revenge, a war fought not for land or resources, but for the honor of a king and the memory of a dead son. The Hittite army swept through the Egyptian-controlled territories of northern Syria, sacking and plundering cities, and taking a large number of Egyptian prisoners of war. The campaign was a resounding success, a clear message to the Egyptians that the Hittites were not to be trifled with. But the victory came with a terrible and completely unexpected price. Among the Egyptian prisoners that the Hittites brought back to their capital of Hattusa, there was a terrible plague, a contagious disease that spread like wildfire through the city. We don't know exactly what this plague was. Some scholars think it was a form of smallpox, but we do know it was devastating. It swept through the Hittite population, killing hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And in a tragic twist of fate, the plague eventually claimed the life of Suppiluliuma I himself. The great king who had built the Hittite Empire, who had defeated the Mitanni and challenged the Egyptians, died not on a battlefield, but in his own palace, a victim of a disease brought back by his own triumphant army. It's a bit of a tragic joke, isn't it? He had survived countless battles and political intrigues, only to be taken down by a microscopic enemy. He was succeeded by his son, Anawanda II, the same man who had led the campaign against Egypt. But Anawanda was not long for this world either. The plague, which was still raging through the kingdom, soon claimed his life as well. The Hittite throne, which had just been made stable and secure, was once again in turmoil. The death of two kings in such a short amount of time threw the empire into a panic. It was a dark, frightening time, a period of uncertainty and fear. The Hittite Empire had reached its peak under Suppiluliuma I, and now, with his death, it seemed to be in danger of collapsing from the inside once again. The plague continued to ravage the kingdom for years, and it was left to a new king, Suppiluliuma's third son, Mursili II, to try and hold the empire together. Mursili II, a young and inexperienced king, inherited a kingdom that was facing rebellion on all sides and a deadly plague that was decimating his population. It was a Herculean task. He was not a conqueror like his father, but a restorer, a man who had to rebuild a kingdom that was on the verge of collapse. He had to deal with the rebellions first, and he did so with a great deal of skill and determination. He led a series of military campaigns against the rebellious kingdoms in Anatolia and Syria, and he was surprisingly successful. He was a different kind of king from his father, but he was no less effective. He had to be. The survival of the Hittite Empire depended on it. Mursili II also had a special relationship with the gods. He believed that the plague was a punishment from the gods, a divine retribution for the death of Zananza and the breaking of a vow. He recorded his prayers and his lamentations on clay tablets, a fascinating look into the mind of a king who was struggling to understand the will of the gods. He was a deeply religious man, and his faith was a source of strength in a time of great crisis. He believed that if he could appease the gods, the plague would end, and the kingdom would be restored. And in a way, he was right. The plague eventually did subside, and the Hittite Empire was able to recover. Mursili II's reign was a crucial period of recovery and consolidation. He had taken a kingdom on the brink of disaster and brought it back from the edge. He had a lot of work to do, but the foundations that his father had built were still strong, and he was determined to see the Hittite Empire thrive once again. The reign of Mursili II, the son who had to clean up the mess left by his conquering father and the devastating plague, was a time of rebuilding and re-establishing Hittite power. He spent most of his time quelling rebellions and securing his borders, a kind of necessary housekeeping for a great empire. But after his death, the Hittite throne was taken by his son, Muatali II, and with his reign, the stage was once again set for a major conflict. The Hittite Empire had recovered from the plague, and its power was once again on the rise. But to the south, a different kind of power was growing. The new kingdom of Egypt, under the leadership of a new, ambitious pharaoh, was also consolidating its power and looking to expand its influence. That pharaoh was none other than Ramesses II, a man whose name would become synonymous with the grandeur and military might of ancient Egypt. He was a great builder, a great general, and a bit of a show-off. He was the kind of guy who wanted everyone to know how awesome he was. And he had the military to back it up. The two empires, the Hittites under Muwatalli II and the Egyptians under Ramesses II, were now on a collision course. The flashpoint, as always, was northern Syria. The Hittites considered it their rightful territory, a land they had fought and bled for. The Egyptians, who had a long history of dominance in the region, saw it as a key part of their own sphere of influence. For years, the two empires had been engaged in a Cold War, a series of diplomatic spats and proxy conflicts. But now, with both sides led by ambitious young monarchs, that Cold War was about to turn hot. The prize was the city of Kadesh, a strategic fortress on the Orontes River, a city that was a gateway to the rest of Syria and a symbol of dominance. Both sides knew that whoever controlled Kadesh would control the region, and so both sides began to mobilize for war. The Hittites and the Egyptians were about to engage in one of the most famous and most thoroughly documented battles in all of ancient history. Muwatalli II, the Hittite king, was a seasoned general who knew the value of a good strategy. He was also a man who understood the art of deception. He gathered his army, a massive force of Hittite soldiers and their allies from all over Anatolia and Syria, and began his march south towards Kadesh. He was a silent, calculating man, and he wanted to surprise the Egyptians. Ramesses II, on the other hand, was a bit more enthusiastic. He led his army with great pomp and fanfare, confident in his own military prowess. He was a man who loved to be the center of attention, and he wasn't afraid to let everyone know he was coming. Ramesses, in his arrogance, was in for a rude awakening. Muwatalli II had sent out spies, two Bedouin tribesmen, who pretended to be deserters from the Hittite army. When they were captured by the Egyptians, they fed Ramesses II a pack of lies, telling him that the main body of the Hittite army was still far away, and that he could easily take Kadesh with his vanguard. Ramesses, in his youthful overconfidence, fell for the trap, hook, line, and sinker. He was so sure of his victory that he began to march his forces, which were split into 4 divisions named after the gods, to the walls of Kadesh. The first division, the Amun division, arrived at the city and set up camp, completely unaware that the main Hittite army was hidden just over a hill, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Muwatalli II, the patient spider, had set his web, and Ramesses, the arrogant fly, was about to walk right into it. The Hittite army, which was far larger than Ramesses had been led to believe, was a massive force of infantry, and most importantly, a fearsome contingent of over 2,000 chariots, a number that would have been shocking to the Egyptians. The Hittite chariot corps was the finest in the world, a well-oiled machine of death and destruction. The stage was set, the deception was in place, and the two great empires were about to collide in a battle that would be remembered for centuries. The Battle of Kadesh was not just a battle for a city. It was a battle for bragging rights, a battle for the very soul of the Near East, and the outcome would be a lot more complicated than either king could have imagined. The Battle of Kadesh, the biggest and most documented chariot battle in history, was about to begin. Ramesses II, with his Amun division camped right outside Kadesh, was enjoying a leisurely morning, completely unaware of the massive Hittite army hidden just over the hill. He had been fed bad intelligence and his own arrogance had done the rest. He thought he was walking into a quick, easy victory, but he was actually walking into a carefully laid ambush. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, was a master of strategy, and he had set the perfect trap. As the unsuspecting Egyptian soldiers went about their morning routines, the Hittite chariots, over 2,000 of them, came thundering down from the east. A massive cloud of dust and the terrifying sound of wheels on hard ground. They struck the Armon division's camp with a force that must have been absolutely devastating, scattering the soldiers and throwing the entire Egyptian army into chaos. The surprise was complete. The Hittite chariots, heavier and more powerful than their Egyptian counterparts, were a force of nature. They crashed into the Egyptian camp, their bronze armor glinting in the sun, their horses snorting and kicking. The air was filled with the shouts of men, the clang of metal on metal, and the sickening thud of chariots running over bodies. The Armon division was completely routed, their soldiers fleeing in a panic. The Hittite chariots, in a moment of pure, unadulterated hubris, gave chase, scattering to plunder the Egyptian camp. This was a critical mistake, a moment of weakness that would turn the tide of the battle. The Hittite soldiers, for all their discipline and skill, were still human. They saw the riches of the Egyptian camp, and their discipline gave way to greed. They broke their ranks, and their coordinated attack became a chaotic, unorganized pursuit. It was a classic blunder, a moment of triumph turning into a moment of carelessness. And that carelessness would cost them dearly. Rameses II, who was still with his royal guard, managed to rally the remaining soldiers. With his camp in ruins and his army in full retreat, he was a king on the brink of total annihilation. But in this moment of crisis, he proved why he was considered a great pharaoh. He personally led a charge against the pursuing Hittite chariots, a desperate last-ditch effort to save his army. He fought with a courage that would be immortalized in Egyptian art and poetry, a one-man army against a tidal wave of chariots. He was a man fighting for his life, for his kingdom, and for his legacy. And in the midst of this chaotic battle, a truly lucky break came his way. A contingent of his army, the Nearin, an elite military unit, had been marching towards Kadesh from a different direction and arrived on the battlefield just in the nick of time. They slammed into the Hittite chariots from the flank, a surprise attack that threw the Hittites into disarray. The Hittite chariots, now disorganized and laden with plunder, were no match for this new, fresh Egyptian force. The tide of the battle had turned. The rest of the Hittite army, seeing the turn of events, rushed to support their chariots, and the battle turned into a bloody, chaotic melee. The fighting raged for hours, a brutal back-and-forth struggle. The Hittites had the element of surprise, and the Egyptians had the courage of a desperate king. In the end, neither side could claim a decisive victory. The Hittites had won the initial ambush, but they had failed to annihilate the Egyptian army. The Egyptians had managed to save themselves from total defeat, but they had failed to take the city of Kadesh. Rameses VI would later spin the battle as a glorious personal victory, a story that he would have carved on the walls of his temples and palaces all over Egypt. The Hittite account, which we have found on their own clay tablets, is a bit more humble, but it also paints a picture of a battle that was, at best, a draw. Historians still argue whether the battle was a victory for the Egyptians, a victory for the Hittites, or just a really expensive day trip for both of them. But what is certain is that after the battle, Both armies were exhausted, and a new kind of war was about to begin. The Battle of Kadesh was a spectacular, bloody, and ultimately inconclusive affair. Both sides, the Hittites under Muwatalli II and the Egyptians under Ramesses II, had taken heavy losses, and neither had achieved their primary objective. The Hittites had failed to completely destroy the Egyptian army, and the Egyptians had failed to capture Kadesh. It was a draw, a kind of ancient world standoff that left both empires bruised and exhausted. For the next several years, the two great powers continued to fight, but it was a much more low-key kind of warfare, a series of border skirmishes and minor campaigns. It was a war of attrition, a kind of long, slow, grinding conflict that was draining for both sides. The cost of a full-scale war was simply too high, and neither king was willing to risk everything for a city that, while important, was not worth the destruction of their respective armies. It was a moment of realization for both empires, a sobering lesson in the limits of military power. The Great War between the two superpowers was, for the time being, on pause. But the war had a profound effect on both sides. In Egypt, Ramesses II used the battle as a propaganda tool, a way to cement his legacy as a great warrior king. He had the battle carved in glorious detail on the walls of his temples, a visual narrative of his personal courage and his divine victory over the Hittites. He was a master of self-promotion, a kind of ancient world PR agent for himself. He had managed to snatch a draw from the jaws of defeat, and he made sure everyone knew it. The Egyptian people, who were tired of war and wanted to see their pharaoh as a hero, were more than happy to go along with the narrative. In the Hittite Empire, the reaction was a bit more subdued. They had a victory to celebrate, but it was a victory that came at a great cost. They had humiliated the Egyptians, but they hadn't defeated them. The Hittite royal court, a place where a king's reputation was made and broken, was probably a lot less enthusiastic about the whole thing. The king, Muwatalli II, died a few years after the battle, and the throne was taken by his son, Hittite, who was probably just as exhausted by the war as his father had been. The war between the Hittites and Egyptians, which had been simmering for decades, finally came to an end in 1259 BCE with the signing of a peace treaty. This treaty, one of the most remarkable and important documents from the ancient world, is known to us as the Egyptian-Hittite Peace Treaty, or the Treaty of Kadesh. It was a formal agreement, a contract between two great powers, and it was a masterpiece of international diplomacy. The treaty was signed by the Hittite king Hattusili III, the brother of Muwatalli II, and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. The treaty was not just a simple promise to stop fighting. It was a detailed, complex document that laid out the terms of a long-lasting peace. It included a non-aggression pact, a promise of mutual defense against a third party, and an extradition clause for political refugees. It was, in effect, a defensive alliance between the two great empires. It was also, as far as we know, the world's first formal international peace treaty. The two empires, who had been locked in a bitter struggle for decades, had finally decided that they were better off as friends than as enemies. The peace treaty was a testament to the wisdom of both kings. Ramesses II, for all his boasting, knew that a war with the Hittites was unwinnable. Hattusili III, who had taken the throne after a bit of a palace coup against his nephew, knew that a stable kingdom was more important than a long, drawn-out war. The treaty was a win for both of them. It allowed the Hittites to focus on their own internal problems and their other rivals, and it allowed the Egyptians to focus on their own ambitious building projects. The peace between the two empires would last for decades, a period of unprecedented stability in the Near East. The treaty, which was written in both Akkadian, the international language of diplomacy, and hieroglyphs, was a symbol of a new era. The Hittites and Egyptians had gone from bitter rivals to firm allies, and the world was, for a little while anyway, a bit more peaceful because of it. With the great treaty signed and peace established between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the Hittite Empire entered a period of relative calm and prosperity. The kings were no longer focused on endless wars with a great rival, and they could now turn their attention to other, more important matters. And one of the most important aspects of Hittite life, something that was a constant thread woven through the entire history of the kingdom, was their religion and mythology. The Hittites were a deeply religious people, a culture that was, to put it mildly, obsessed with its gods. They had a huge, complex pantheon of deities, and their religious practices were a strange and wonderful blend of their own traditions and the traditions of all the cultures they had conquered and interacted with. It was a kind of religious melting pot, a place where gods from different cultures were worshipped side by side. The most important of the Hittite gods was the storm god, a powerful deity who was the master of the heavens and the earthly king of the gods. He was a bit like the Hittite version of Zeus, a powerful, temperamental god who held sway over thunder, lightning, and rain. His consort was the sun goddess of Arina, the queen of the gods, a powerful and compassionate deity who was the protector of the Hittite monarchy and the source of all life. She was a bit like a mother figure for the entire empire, a kind of benevolent matriarch who watched over her people. These two were the main deities of the Hittite pantheon, but they were far from the only ones. The Hittites had an estimated 1,000 gods and goddesses, a number that is just kind of ridiculously high. They even had a god of the blacksmith's furnace, a deity for the barley harvest, and even a god of the road. They were a people who saw a divine presence in every aspect of their lives, from the sun in the sky to the stones on the ground. This massive pantheon wasn't just a result of a deep-seated belief in the divine. It was also a product of their unique cultural history. As the Hittites expanded their empire, they didn't just conquer the lands of their rivals, they also adopted their gods. When they conquered the Hatti people, they adopted their gods. When they conquered the Hurrians of Mitanni, they adopted their gods. They were a bit like a collector of fine art, but instead of paintings, they collected gods. They would bring the statues of the conquered people's gods back to Hattusa and give them a place in their own temples. It was a surprisingly tolerant approach to religion, a kind of more the merrier philosophy. They believed that if a god was powerful enough to have followers in another land, then they were powerful enough to be worshipped in the Hittite Empire. And this religious tolerance was also a brilliant piece of political strategy. By adopting the gods of the people they had conquered, they were also, in a way, incorporating the conquered people into their own culture. It was a way to make them feel like they were a part of the empire, not just a conquered people. It was a clever way to keep the peace. The Hittite religion wasn't just about worshipping gods. It was also about rituals and festivals, elaborate ceremonies that were performed throughout the year to ensure the gods were happy and the crops would grow. They had festivals for the harvest, festivals for the new year, and festivals to appease the gods in times of plague or famine. These rituals were a massive part of Hittite public life, a kind of ancient world civic duty. The king himself, as the high priest of the kingdom, was responsible for making sure these rituals were performed correctly. He was a religious leader as well as a military one, a kind of king-priest who was the link between the mortal world and the divine. The Hittite myths, which we have found on their clay tablets, are a wonderful mix of creation myths, tales of gods and heroes, and accounts of their own history. They have a story about a dragon-slaying hero, a kind of Hittite version of Saint George, and a myth about a god who vanishes and must be brought back to the land to bring back spring. These myths are a window into the Hittite soul, a way to understand what they believed and what they valued. They were a people who saw themselves as a part of a larger cosmic drama, a drama that was played out in the heavens and on the earth. The Hittite Empire was not just a military and religious powerhouse. It was also a society with a complex and surprisingly progressive legal system. While most of their neighbors, like the Assyrians and Babylonians, were still using a legal code that was all about an eye for an eye, the Hittites were a bit more reasonable. Their laws, which we have found on a series of clay tablets, were a bit like a modern-day legal code, a set of detailed, well-thought-out rules and regulations that were designed to create a more just and orderly society. This wasn't a kingdom where a minor transgression would get you a major punishment. It was a kingdom that was more focused on restitution and compensation than on simple, brutal vengeance. It was a sign of a society that was more concerned with keeping the peace than with a simple desire for blood. The Hittite legal code, which is a truly fascinating document, is divided into a series of laws, each one dealing with a specific crime or transgression. They cover everything from property rights to sexual offenses to murder. For instance, if you were to steal a cow in the Hittite Empire, you wouldn't just be executed on the spot. Instead, you would be required to pay a fine, usually in the form of a certain number of cows, to the person you had stolen from. The fine would be a way to compensate the victim and to punish the perpetrator, a system that was a lot more balanced than the more brutal legal codes of the time. The Hittites also had a clear understanding of the difference between intentional and unintentional harm. If you accidentally killed someone, the punishment was less severe than if you had killed them in a fit of rage. This was a really advanced legal concept for the ancient world, a sign of a society that was a bit more nuanced in its understanding of human nature. But the Hittite legal code wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. It was still a society of its time, and some of the punishments were still a bit harsh. If you were a sorcerer, for instance, you would be executed. And if you were to have an affair with a priestess, you would both be put to death. It was a society that was deeply concerned with the sanctity of its religious traditions, and any transgression against those traditions was seen as a serious crime. The laws also had a clear distinction between the rich and the poor, and the punishments were often more severe for the lower classes. It was a class-based system, a bit like a modern-day traffic court, where the rich can afford a better lawyer. But even with these flaws, the Hittite legal code was a remarkable document, a testament to a society that was more concerned with law and order than with simple, brutal vengeance. It was a society that was a lot more progressive than its neighbors. The Hittite society was a well-structured one. a bit like a pyramid. At the very top was the king, the great king of Hatti, the high priest of the kingdom, and the commander-in-chief of the army. He was a god on earth, a divine ruler who held absolute power. Below him was a class of nobles and warriors, the aristocracy of the kingdom, men who owned land and were responsible for leading the army in times of war. Below them was a class of scribes and priests, the intellectuals and the religious leaders of the kingdom, men who were responsible for recording the laws, the myths, and the history of the kingdom. And at the very bottom was the vast majority of the population, the farmers and the laborers, the men and women who worked the land and built the temples. It was a clear, unambiguous social hierarchy, a bit like a modern-day corporation with a clear CEO and a whole lot of lower-level employees, and for a society that was as diverse as the Hittite Empire, a society that was a blend of a dozen different cultures. This clear social structure was a key to keeping the peace. It was a way to make sure everyone knew their place and their role in the kingdom. This clear social structure and progressive legal system were a major part of the Hittite success. They were a society that was built on a foundation of order and law, a society that was able to absorb a dozen different cultures and keep them all working together. It was a testament to the Hittite genius for organization and their understanding of human nature. They were a people who knew that a stable society was a strong society, and they built a kingdom that was, for a time anyway, one of the most stable and most powerful in the entire Near East. They had a legal code that was centuries ahead of its time, a society that was well organized, and a religion that was a beautiful blend of a dozen different cultures. They were a people who were a lot more than just a bunch of chariot-driving conquerors. They were a civilization, and their biggest secret weapon was about to be revealed to the world. The Hittite Empire was a great power, a well-organized civilization with a surprisingly advanced legal and social structure. But they had a secret weapon, a piece of technology that gave them a massive advantage over their rivals. This wasn't some kind of chariot with a rocket engine or a catapult that shot fire. It was something much more mundane, much more subtle, but also much more revolutionary. Iron. The Hittites were the earliest known masters of ironworking, a skill they had perfected and kept a closely guarded secret for centuries. While the rest of the world was still living in the Bronze Age, the Hittites were quietly ushering in the Iron Age, and that gave them a technological advantage that was almost impossible to beat. Bronze, which is a mix of copper and tin, is a great metal, but it's also a bit of a pain to make. It requires a lot of resources, and it's not all that strong. Iron, on the other hand, is a much more common resource, and once you figure out how to work it, it's a lot stronger and a lot more durable. The Hittites, who lived in a land with a lot of iron ore, had figured out how to smelt the metal and turn it into weapons and tools. They had developed a process of heating and hammering the iron, a process that made it stronger and more durable. This wasn't a sudden discovery, but a slow, gradual process of trial and error. A process that must have taken generations to perfect. And when they finally got it right, they had a weapon that was simply superior to anything their rivals could produce. A Hittite sword, forged from iron, was sharper, stronger, and more durable than a bronze sword. It was a weapon that could break a bronze sword with a single blow. This gave the Hittite soldiers a massive advantage on the battlefield, a kind of ancient world superpower. The Hittite army wasn't just a force of well-trained soldiers and fast chariots. It was a force of iron-wielding super soldiers. This knowledge of ironworking was one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Hittite Empire. They didn't share it with anyone, not even their closest allies. They knew that this technology was the key to their dominance, and they were not about to give it away. They were a bit like a modern-day tech company with a patent on a revolutionary new product. They were a monopoly, and they were not about to let anyone else in on the secret. The Hittite kings would even write to the pharaohs of Egypt, politely declining their requests for iron, saying that the iron they had was a precious commodity, and that it was a bit like a family heirloom that they couldn't just give away. It was a polite, but firm, way of saying, "No, you can't have our super secret technology." The Hittites had an advantage, and they were going to use it for as long as they could. But secrets, especially really important ones, are hard to keep. Over time, the knowledge of ironworking began to trickle out of the Hittite Empire. Smiths from other lands, who had either been captured by the Hittites or had simply learned the process through trade, began to bring the technology to their own kingdoms. It was a slow process, a bit like a leaking faucet, but it was happening. And by the time of the Bronze Age collapse, which was a period of widespread chaos and destruction across the Near East, the knowledge of ironworking was no longer a Hittite secret. It was a technology that was spreading all over the world, a technology that was about to change the face of warfare and society forever. The Hittites had started the Iron Age, but they were not going to be the only ones to enjoy it. The very technology that had made them so powerful was now in the hands of their rivals. This new technology, which was cheaper and more accessible than bronze, had a profound effect on the world. It democratized warfare in a way. No longer was a powerful, bronze-wielding army the only thing that mattered. A smaller army, with a few well-forged iron swords, could now take on a much larger force. It was a kind of leveling of the playing field, a moment where the old rules of warfare were thrown out the window. And for the Hittites, a kingdom that had relied on its technological superiority for so long, this was a massive problem. Their great advantage was now gone, and they were just another powerful empire in a world that was becoming more and more dangerous. The Iron Age, which they had started, was now coming back to haunt them. And it was just one of a number of problems that were about to come crashing down on the Hittite Empire. The Hittite Empire, now with its ironworking secret no longer a secret, was facing a new and terrifying reality. The world around them was changing, and it was changing fast. This was the late Bronze Age, a period that was, for all intents and purposes, a kind of ancient world utopia. There was a complex network of trade routes, a system of international diplomacy, and a number of great empires, like Egypt, Mycenaean Greece, and Assyria, that were all coexisting more or less peacefully. It was a world of shared culture and a shared language of diplomacy, a kind of ancient United Nations. But this world, which had been so stable for so long, was about to come crashing down. This was the Bronze Age collapse, a period of widespread upheaval and destruction that would change the face of the Near East and the Mediterranean forever. It was a kind of ancient world apocalypse, a time when 1,000 years of progress would be wiped out in a single terrifying century. The causes of the Bronze Age collapse are still a matter of scholarly debate. It wasn't one single event, but a kind of perfect storm of different problems, all of them happening at the same time. One of the biggest problems was a series of droughts and famines that swept across the entire region. The climate, which had been stable for centuries, was now changing, and the lack of rain was causing widespread crop failures. This led to food shortages, which in turn led to economic collapse and political instability. The great empires, which had been so powerful and so stable, were now facing a crisis that they were completely unprepared for. The people who were starving and desperate began to turn on their leaders. It was a kind of peasant revolt on a massive scale, a kind of societal breakdown that was happening all over the Near East. The Hittite Empire, which was already facing a number of problems, was now facing a famine that was crippling its economy and weakening its hold on its vast territory. Another major problem was a series of massive earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that were happening all over the region. The great cities, which had been the centers of these empires, were being destroyed, their walls crumbling, their palaces turning to rubble. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, a city that had been the heart of the empire for centuries, was particularly vulnerable. It was built on a series of fault lines, and it was a city that was constantly being rocked by tremors. The destruction of these cities was not just a physical problem. It was a psychological one as well. The people who had been living in a world that was stable and orderly were now living in a world that was literally falling apart. Their gods, who had been so powerful and so benevolent, now seemed to be angry and absent. It was a time of great fear and great uncertainty, a time when a civilization's very sense of itself was being questioned. And on top of all of this, there was a new kind of warfare, a kind of warfare that was more brutal and more destructive than anything that had come before. The old empires, with their disciplined armies and their powerful chariots, were now facing a new kind of enemy, a bunch of disorganized but incredibly violent raiders who were attacking from the sea. These were the Sea Peoples, a group of enigmatic marauders who were sweeping across the Mediterranean and the Near East, a kind of ancient world pirate army that was attacking everything in its path. We don't know where they came from. Some scholars think they were a group of refugees from the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. Others think they were a group of mercenaries who had lost their jobs. But what we do know is that they were a force of pure, unadulterated destruction. They were attacking coastal cities, burning and plundering everything in their path. And the Hittite Empire, which had a long coastline on the Mediterranean, was particularly vulnerable. The Hittite Empire was a giant, a lumbering, slow-moving behemoth that was now facing 1,000 tiny cuts, and it was bleeding out. The great empire that had ruled the Near East for centuries was about to come to a quiet and tragic end. The age of empires was over, and a new, much more chaotic age was about to begin. The Bronze Age world was crumbling, and the Hittite Empire was right in the middle of it. As famine, earthquakes, and political chaos ravaged the great empires, a new and terrifying threat emerged from the sea. These were the Sea Peoples, a vague, enigmatic collection of marauders who have left behind a trail of devastation and very little else. We know about them mostly from Egyptian sources, particularly the relief carvings on the walls of the temple of Medinet Habu, where Pharaoh Rameses III describes a great battle he fought against them. He portrays them as a diverse bunch of invaders, a coalition of different tribes and peoples, all of them armed and all of them hungry for plunder. They were a kind of ancient world pirate confederacy, a force of pure, unadulterated destruction that was sweeping across the Mediterranean. The names of their tribes are a bit like a roll call of ancient world bad guys: the Peliset, the Jaker, the Shardana, and the Luka. These names are a bit of a mystery, a kind of ancient world alphabet soup, but what is certain is that they were a force of nature, a kind of unstoppable wave that was washing away the old world and ushering in a new one. The Hittite Empire, with its long coastline and its vast sprawling territory, was a prime target. The Sea Peoples, with their fast ships and their brutal tactics, were attacking coastal cities all over the Near East. They would land their ships, plunder a city, and then sail away, leaving behind a trail of burning buildings and dead bodies. The Hittite Empire, which had been so good at fighting other empires, was completely unprepared for this kind of hit-and-run warfare. Their army, which was designed for large-scale battles on land, was a lumbering, slow-moving behemoth that was no match for the speed and agility of the Sea Peoples. The Hittite king, who was probably the last great Hittite king, a man named Suppiluliuma Dan, was desperately trying to hold the empire together. He led a series of campaigns against the Sea Peoples, but he was a bit like a man trying to catch smoke with his hands. He could defeat them in one place, only to have them pop up in another. The Sea Peoples weren't a single army with a single capital. They were 1,000 different little fires, all of them burning at the same time. But the Sea Peoples weren't the only problem. The Hittite Empire was also facing a number of internal rebellions and a series of devastating famines. The kingdom was a bit like a house with 1,000 different leaks, and Suppiluliuma II was running around with 1,000 different buckets, trying to catch them all. The problem was that he was running out of buckets. The Hittite Empire, which had been so strong for so long, was now on the brink of collapse. The capital of Hattusa, a city that had been the heart of the empire for centuries, was now a place of fear and uncertainty. The population, which was starving and afraid, was beginning to lose faith in their king and their gods. The end was coming, and everyone could feel it. The great empire that had ruled the Near East was now a dying giant, a king on his deathbed, surrounded by 1,000 different vultures, all of them waiting for him to die. The Sea Peoples, with their relentless attacks and their brutal tactics, were the final nail in the coffin. They were the ones who finally pushed the Hittite Empire over the edge. But they weren't the only ones to blame. The Hittite Empire was a giant with 1,000 different weaknesses, and the Sea Peoples were just the ones who happened to find all of them at once. The collapse of the Bronze Age, with its famines, its earthquakes, and its political chaos, was the real killer. The Sea Peoples were just the executioners, the ones who finally put the old world out of its misery. And when the dust finally settled, the great Hittite Empire was gone. Its capital was in ruins, its people were scattered, and its legacy was about to be buried under 2,000 years of sand and silence. But the story doesn't quite end there. The Hittite people, who had been so resilient for so long, were not just going to disappear into the dust. They would, in a way, survive. They would, in a strange and wonderful twist of fate, rise again, but in a new form and in a new place. As the Bronze Age collapsed in a final, terrifying wave of destruction, the Hittite Empire was gasping its last breaths. The last great king, Suppiluliuma II, was a man trying to save a sinking ship. He was a warrior, a general, a man who had fought against the Sea Peoples and against 100 different rebellions. but he was no match for the forces of history. The end of the Hittite Empire wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, quiet fade into obscurity. The great city of Hattusa, the heart of the empire for centuries, was slowly abandoned. We don't know exactly why. Maybe the city had been destroyed by an earthquake. Maybe the population had been decimated by a famine. Or maybe the king and the nobility had just decided to leave, to abandon a city that had become a symbol of a dying world. Whatever the reason, the great city was left to the wind and the dust, its palaces turning to rubble, its temples turning to ruin. The scribes, who had been so meticulous in their record-keeping for centuries, simply stopped writing. The last clay tablets we have from Hattusa are a sad, melancholy collection of laments, of prayers to a god who was no longer listening. The end of the Hittite Empire was a kind of a forgotten tragedy. It didn't get the same kind of publicity as the fall of Troy or the sack of Rome. It was a kingdom that just quietly disappeared from the historical record, a kind of ghost in the machine of history. The great city of Hattusa, the heart of the empire, was left to the wind and the dust, its palaces turning to rubble, its temples turning to ruin. The scribes, who had been so meticulous in their record-keeping for centuries, simply stopped writing. The last clay tablets we have from Hattusa are a sad, melancholy collection of laments, of prayers to a god who was no longer listening. It was as if the entire civilization had just taken a long, deep breath and then stopped. The great empire that had ruled the Near East for centuries was now a forgotten memory, a whisper in the wind. The Hittite people, the ones who had been so strong and so resilient, were now scattered, a population of refugees and exiles, all of them looking for a new home and a new future. But the story doesn't quite end there. The Hittite people, the ones who had been so resilient for so long, were not just going to disappear into the dust. They would, in a way, survive. They would, in a strange and wonderful twist of fate, rise again, but in a new form and in a new place. The Hittite culture, which had been so beautifully blended with the culture of the Hatti and the Hurrians, was not just going to be wiped out. It would, in a way, live on. The Hittite nobility, the great lords and generals, had probably fled the collapsing empire and established new, smaller kingdoms in northern Syria. These were the so-called Neo-Hittite kingdoms, a collection of city-states that were a kind of echo of the old empire. They weren't a single unified kingdom, but they were a collection of city-states that were a kind of echo of the old empire. They were the last sad remnants of a dying world. These Neo-Hittite kingdoms, which flourished for several centuries after the collapse, were a bit like the last flickering flame of a dying fire. They were a place where the old Hittite traditions, the old gods, and the old language were still being used. They were a place where the memory of the great empire was still alive. They were also a kind of cultural crossroads, a place where Hittite traditions were being blended with the traditions of the new cultures that were emerging in the region, like the Arameans and the Assyrians. These city-states were a kind of cultural mosaic, a place where 100 different cultures were all living together, more or less peacefully. But even these small, resilient kingdoms would not last forever. They were a bit like a rowboat in a stormy sea, and the storms of history were still raging. They were eventually swallowed up by the Assyrian Empire, a new, much more ruthless, and much more powerful empire that was emerging from the east. The last remnants of the great Hittite Empire were gone. The Hittite civilization was now a ghost, a whisper in the wind, a memory that would soon be forgotten. The world had moved on, and the Hittites were a part of the past, with the great city of Hattusa, a pile of rubble, and the last of the Neo-Hittite kingdoms swallowed up by the Assyrians. The Hittite civilization was officially gone. For the next 2,000 years, they would be a forgotten people, a footnote in the grand tapestry of human history. Their language was unreadable. Their cities were buried under layers of sand and time, and their names were just a series of strange sounds in the Bible. A kind of mythical people who lived in a land that no one could quite locate. The world had moved on, and the Hittites were a memory that had faded to a ghost. But as we all know, history has a funny way of coming back to haunt us. The 19th century, with its newfound obsession with archaeology and the ancient world, was a time of great rediscovery. The world of Mesopotamia, with its ziggurats and its cuneiform tablets, was being unearthed, and the world of Egypt, with its pyramids and its hieroglyphs, was being unlocked. It was a time of great excitement, a time when 1,000 years of history were being brought back to life. And in the midst of all this, a number of strange discoveries were being made in what we now know as Turkey. Travelers and scholars who were exploring the area were coming across a number of strange inscriptions, a series of hieroglyphic carvings that were unlike anything they had ever seen before. These weren't Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were different, more geometric, more weird. No one knew what they were, or who had written them. They were a kind of puzzle, a series of strange symbols that were completely unreadable. For decades, these inscriptions were a complete mystery, a kind of historical brick wall that no one could get past. They were a bit like a secret code, a message from a forgotten world that no one could decipher. And the mystery of these hieroglyphs would only get deeper when archaeologists, who were now digging in the area, started to find a number of clay tablets. Tablets that were written not in hieroglyphs, but in cuneiform. But this wasn't Mesopotamian cuneiform. It was a different kind of cuneiform, a language that was just as unreadable as the hieroglyphs. It was as if the universe was just having a laugh, throwing two different, unreadable languages at the archaeologists and saying, "Good luck with that." The mystery of these strange languages, the hieroglyphs, and the cuneiform would finally begin to unravel in the early 20th century. A British archaeologist named Charles Texier was exploring the area around a modern-day village called Bogaskoi, which happened to be built on the ruins of the ancient city of Hattusa. He was a kind of Indiana Jones, a man who loved a good mystery, and he was convinced that this place, this forgotten city, was the key to unlocking the past. He began to dig, and what he found was incredible. He found the ruins of a massive city, a city with huge stone walls, with palaces and temples, a city that was a lot more grand and a lot more important than anyone had ever imagined. He had, in effect, found the capital of a lost empire. But even with the city found, the languages were still unreadable. The Hittite civilization, a civilization that had ruled for centuries and had left behind 1,000 different texts, was still a ghost. The world knew that they had existed, but they still knew nothing about them. But the real breakthrough would come from a Czech scholar named Bedřich Hrozný. Hrozný was a linguist, a man who was obsessed with ancient languages, and he was determined to solve the mystery of the Hittite cuneiform. He began to study the tablets that had been found at Bogaskoi, and he started to notice a pattern. He noticed that the word for bread in one of the tablets was very similar to the word for bread in Latin and German. This was a massive discovery. It was the first clue, the first crack in the code. He realized that the Hittite language was not a Semitic language like Akkadian, or a local Anatolian language like Hatti. It was an Indo-European language, a distant relative of English and German. It was a bit like finding out that a long-lost cousin you thought was dead was actually living on another continent. It was a stunning revelation, a kind of historical eureka moment. The Hittite language was now, for the first time in 2,000 years, a little bit readable. The ghost of the Hittite Empire was now beginning to speak, and its story was about to be told. The discovery that the Hittite language was a member of the Indo-European family of languages was a massive breakthrough, a kind of linguistic key that unlocked a door that had been sealed for millennia. Bedřich Hrozný, the brilliant Czech scholar who had made the discovery, began to systematically translate the Hittite cuneiform tablets, a monumental task that would take him years to complete. He was a bit like a detective, a man who was slowly and painstakingly piecing together a long-lost story from 1,000 different fragments. And as he translated more and more tablets, the story of the Hittite Empire began to emerge, not as a vague mythical people, but as a real, living, breathing civilization. We started to learn about their kings, their queens, their battles, their laws, and their religion. We were, for the first time in 2,000 years, able to hear the voices of the Hittites, to read their prayers, their letters, and their historical records. It was a kind of historical resurrection, a moment where a lost world was finally brought back to life. And what a world it was! The tablets, which were found in the royal archives of Hattusa, were a treasure trove of information. They were a kind of ancient world library, a collection of texts that covered every aspect of Hittite life. We found treaties and diplomatic correspondence, including the letters from the Egyptian queen, Ankhesenamun. We found legal codes, a set of detailed, well-thought-out laws that were a lot more progressive than anyone had ever imagined. We found mythological texts, a collection of stories about gods and heroes that were a beautiful blend of Hittite, Hatti, and Hurrian traditions. We found royal edicts, including the famous Edict of Telepinu, a document that had put an end to a century of civil war. We found historical texts, a series of annals that recounted the reigns of the great Hittite kings, from the early conquerors like Hattusili the Fund to the last great king, Suppiluliuma II. It was a complete, well-rounded picture of a civilization that had been completely forgotten for so long. The translation of the Hittite tablets was a bit like a cultural excavation. We were not just unearthing artifacts, we were unearthing ideas. We were learning about the Hittite worldview, their values, their fears, and their hopes. We were learning that they were not just a bunch of chariot-driving barbarians, but a complex, sophisticated, and surprisingly tolerant civilization. We were learning that they were a people who loved their gods, who valued law and order, and who were capable of great works of art and literature. The Hittite archives, a collection of thousands of clay tablets, were a kind of Rosetta Stone for an entire civilization. They were the key that unlocked the Hittite story, and they were the reason that we know anything about them today. Without them, the Hittites would still be a ghost, a whisper in the wind. But with them, they were a real, living, breathing people. A people who had a story to tell. And the story they had to tell was a story of a great empire that had risen from the dust. A kingdom that had survived a century of civil war. a civilization that had mastered the art of war and diplomacy, and a people who had created a beautiful and complex culture. It was a story that was 1,000 years long, a story that was filled with heroes and villains, with triumphs and tragedies, with love and loss. It was a story that was, in a way, a reflection of the human experience. The Hittites were a people who had tried to build a world that was stable and just, a world that was a bit more peaceful and a bit more orderly. They were a people who had tried to create a society that was a little bit better than the one they had inherited. And for a time, they had succeeded. The Hittite Empire was not just a historical curiosity. It was a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that even in the most chaotic of times, it is possible to build something that is beautiful and lasting. And the story was not just in the tablets. It was also in the ground, in the stones, and the rubble of the great city of Hattusa. With the Hittite language finally deciphered, the archaeologists now had a roadmap, a kind of ancient world GPS to guide their excavations. They knew what they were looking for and where to find it. The city of Hattusa, the forgotten capital that had been a puzzle for centuries, was now a place of incredible discovery. The excavations, which had started in the late 19th century, now took on a new sense of purpose and urgency. The archaeologists, a new generation of scholars who were armed with the knowledge of the Hittite language, began to unearth the city in a systematic and scientific way. And what they found was a city that was even more magnificent and more complex than they had ever imagined. It was a city that was a testament to the power, the wealth, and the organizational genius of the Hittite Empire. It was a city that was a kind of open-air museum, a place where 1,000 years of history were laid bare for all to see. The excavations at Hattusa revealed a city that was a kind of fortress, a city that was built to last. The city was surrounded by a massive stone wall, a wall that was over 6 kilometers long and was punctuated by a series of imposing gates. These gates were not just a simple entrance and exit. They were works of art, monumental structures that were decorated with sculptures of lions, sphinxes, and warriors. The most famous of these gates is the Lion Gate, a massive structure that is flanked by 2 huge stone lions, their mouths open in a silent roar. The Lion Gate was a bit like a grand entrance to a kingdom, a way of saying, "We are here, and we are not to be messed with." The excavations also revealed a massive temple district, a collection of temples and shrines that were dedicated to the thousands of gods and goddesses in the Hittite pantheon. The temples were a place of worship and a place of power, a place where the king, as the high priest, would perform his rituals and commune with the divine. It was a place that was the spiritual heart of the Hittite Empire. The most important discovery at Hattusa was the royal citadel, a massive complex of palaces, administrative buildings, and military barracks that was the political heart of the empire. It was here, in the royal citadel, that the king ruled his vast kingdom, that he met with foreign dignitaries, and that he held his court. And it was here, in the citadel, that the royal archives were found, the same archives that had been so crucial in the decipherment of the Hittite language. The discovery of these archives was a bit like finding the blueprints to a 1,000-year-old building. They were a guide to the Hittite world, a window into their lives, their thoughts, and their beliefs. The excavations also revealed a massive tunnel system, a series of underground tunnels that were used to move soldiers and supplies in times of siege. The tunnels were a marvel of ancient engineering, a sign of a society that was as clever as it was powerful. The entire city of Hattusa was a testament to the Hittite genius for organization and their understanding of war and defense. But the excavations at Hattusa weren't just about finding big, impressive buildings. They were also about finding the small, intimate details of daily life. The archaeologists found pottery, tools, weapons, and jewelry, a collection of artifacts that told us about the lives of the ordinary Hittite people. We learned about their diet, their clothing, their social customs, and their religious beliefs. We learned that they were a people who loved their food, their wine, and their music. We learned that they were a people who were, in many ways, just like us. The excavations at Hattusa were a kind of time machine, a way of going back in time and seeing a lost world, a world that had been forgotten for so long. The great city of Hattusa, which had been a ghost for so long, was now a living, breathing place. A place where 1,000 years of history were laid bare for all to see. It was a place that was a testament to the power of archaeology and the human desire to know our own story. And the story was not just in the ruins. It was also in the legacy that the Hittites had left behind. The Hittite Empire, which had been a forgotten civilization for over 2 millennia, was now, thanks to the tireless work of archaeologists and linguists, a living, breathing reality. The story of their rise and fall, a story that had been buried under the dust of time, was now being told. But the Hittites didn't just disappear. Their legacy, a kind of ghost in the machine of history, continued to live on. The Hittites had a profound influence on the cultures that came after them, a kind of ripple effect that changed the face of the Near East and the Mediterranean. Their political and legal systems, their religious traditions, and their military tactics were all adopted and adapted by the cultures that came after them. The Hittites were a kind of cultural bridge, a link between the ancient world of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the new world of Greece and Rome. One of the most important aspects of their legacy was their law and government. The Hittites, with their surprisingly progressive legal code and their well-organized government, were a kind of role model for the cultures that came after them. The Assyrians, who were a new, more powerful empire that was emerging from the east, adopted many of the Hittite legal and political traditions. The idea of a strong, centralized government, a government that was ruled by a single powerful king, was a Hittite idea, and it was an idea that was adopted and refined by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The Hittites were also the first to establish a formal international peace treaty, a kind of diplomatic agreement that was a new and revolutionary idea. This idea of a formal written treaty, a treaty that was a contract between two different nations, was a Hittite innovation, and it was an idea that would be adopted by every culture that came after them, from the Greeks to the Romans to us today. The Hittite influence was also felt in their religion and mythology. The Hittites, with their huge, complex pantheon of gods and their rich, vibrant mythology, were a kind of cultural melting pot. Their gods and goddesses, which were a blend of a dozen different traditions, were adopted and adapted by the cultures that came after them. The Hurrian storm god, who was a part of the Hittite pantheon, eventually found his way into the Greek pantheon as the god Zeus. The Hittite myth of the vanishing god, a myth that was a part of their New Year festival, eventually found its way into Greek mythology as the story of Persephone and the seasons. The Hittite myths and legends, which were so full of gods and heroes, were a kind of wellspring for the cultures that came after them. They were a kind of historical echo, a story that was told and retold, a story that was a part of the cultural fabric of the Near East and the Mediterranean. And of course, there was their technology. The Hittites, with their secret of ironworking, were the ones who had started the Iron Age. They were the ones who had unlocked the power of this new, revolutionary metal. And while they were not the only ones to enjoy it, they were the ones who had shown the world how it was done. The knowledge of ironworking, which had been a closely guarded secret for so long, eventually spread all over the world. It was a kind of technological revolution, a moment where the old world of bronze was replaced by the new world of iron. The Hittites, a forgotten people, were the ones who had started it all. Their legacy, a legacy of law, government, religion, and technology, was a kind of a testament to their genius. They were a people who had not just lived in history, they had made history. The Hittites, who had been a ghost for so long, were now a part of our story, a part of our collective memory. Their story, a story of a great empire that had risen from the dust and had fallen back into it, was a kind of a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the greatest of empires can fall. But it was also a story of resilience, a story of a people who had survived a century of civil war and 1,000 years of forgetfulness. It was a story that was a testament to the human spirit, a reminder that even when we are gone, our legacy, our ideas, and our culture can live on. A ghost in the machine of history. The rediscovery of the Hittites was in a way a historical miracle. For over 2,000 years, they were a forgotten people, a footnote in the grand tapestry of human history. Their names were just a series of strange sounds in the Bible, a kind of mythical people who lived in a land that no one could quite locate. Their language was unreadable, their cities were buried under layers of sand and time, and their names were just a series of strange sounds in the Bible. A kind of mythical people who lived in a land that no one could quite locate. But with the decipherment of the Hittite language, a new and exciting chapter in the history of archaeology and linguistics began. The world of the Hittites was now open for business, a kind of new frontier for scholars and historians to explore. It was a moment where a lost world was finally brought back to life, a moment where a forgotten people finally had their story told. The decipherment of the Hittite language was a monumental task, a kind of historical Everest that was climbed by a number of brilliant scholars. The first crack in the code, as we've already discussed, was made by Bedřich Hrozný, a Czech scholar who realized that the Hittite language was an Indo-European language. But Hrozny's work was just the beginning. The Hittite language was a complex, difficult language, a language that was a mix of a dozen different dialects, and a language that was written in a kind of clumsy, difficult-to-read cuneiform script. It was a language that was a bit like a linguistic puzzle, a puzzle that required a number of different people to solve. The work of translating the thousands of clay tablets that were found at Hattusa was a collaborative effort, a kind of academic team sport that was played out over decades. Scholars from all over the world, from Germany to America to Turkey, all contributed to the effort. They were a kind of intellectual army, a group of brilliant minds who were all working together to solve the same puzzle. The process of deciphering a lost language is a bit like a detective story. The linguists, who were a bit like forensic detectives, would start with the simplest texts, the ones that were the most likely to have a clear meaning. They would look for patterns, for recurring words and phrases, for names of kings and gods that were a bit more familiar. They would use the more familiar languages, like Akkadian and Egyptian, as a kind of a linguistic crutch, a way to get their feet wet in the new language. They would look for bilingual texts that were written in both Hittite and a more familiar language, and they would use these texts as a kind of a Rosetta Stone, a way to unlock the new language. The Hittite archives were a bit of a dream come true for these linguists. They were filled with hundreds of different texts that covered every aspect of Hittite life. They were a kind of a linguistic goldmine, a place where 1,000 different clues were waiting to be found. And as the linguists began to translate more and more tablets, the story of the Hittites began to emerge, not as a vague mythical people, but as a real, living, breathing civilization. We started to learn about their kings, their queens, their battles, their laws, and their religion. We were, for the first time in 2,000 years, able to hear the voices of the Hittites, to read their prayers, their letters, and their historical records. It was a kind of historical resurrection, a moment where a lost world was finally brought back to life. The decipherment of the Hittite language was not just a linguistic triumph. It was a human triumph, a testament to the power of human curiosity and the human desire to know our own story. It was a moment where a forgotten people, a people who had been a ghost for so long, were finally given a voice. And their voice, which was so full of power and so full of beauty, was now a part of our story, a part of our collective memory. The story of the Hittites was no longer a ghost story. It was a history. The discovery of the Hittites and the decipherment of their language were monumental achievements, but the work of bringing this lost world back to life was far from over. The real heavy lifting was happening on the ground, in the ruins of the great city of Hattusa, the heart of the Hittite Empire. The modern excavations at Hattusa, which are still ongoing, are a kind of historical pilgrimage, a journey into the heart of a lost civilization. The site is a kind of open-air museum, a place where 1,000 years of history are laid bare for all to see. It's a place that is, in a way, a testament to the power of archaeology, the power of a spade and a brush to bring a lost world back to life. The excavations at Hattusa, which have been going on for over 100 years, have been a systematic and scientific process. The archaeologists, a team of dedicated scholars from all over the world, have been meticulously unearthing the city, layer by layer, brick by brick. They have been mapping out the city, finding the foundations of its palaces, its temples, and its walls. They have been unearthing the pottery, the tools, the weapons, and the jewelry, a collection of artifacts that tell us about the lives of the ordinary Hittite people. It's a bit like a giant, multi-generational puzzle, a puzzle that is slowly, painstakingly being put together. The archaeologists are not just looking for grand, impressive buildings. They are also looking for the small, intimate details of daily life, the little things that tell us about the people who lived and died here. The most important part of the excavation is the preservation of the site. Hattusa, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is a fragile place, a place that is vulnerable to the ravages of time and weather. The archaeologists, who are a bit like ancient world conservators, are working to protect the site, to preserve the walls, the gates, and the foundations of the buildings. They are a kind of a historical caretaker, a group of people who are dedicated to making sure that the Hittite story is preserved for future generations. They are working to create a site that is not just a pile of rubble, but a living, breathing place. A place where visitors can come and walk the same streets that the Hittite kings once walked. The city, which was once a place of fear and intrigue, is now a place of history and wonder. But the work at Hattusa is not just about the past. It is also about the future. The excavations at Hattusa are a kind of a living laboratory, a place where new technologies and new ideas are being tested. The archaeologists are using everything from ground-penetrating radar to drones to map out the city and to find new discoveries. They are using 3D modeling and virtual reality to create a kind of digital copy of the city, a place where visitors can come and walk through the streets of Hattusa as it once was. They are a kind of a bridge between the past and the future, a group of people who are using the technology of today to bring the history of yesterday back to life. They are a testament to the power of human curiosity and the human desire to know our own story. The Hittite Empire, which had been a ghost for so long, is now a living, breathing part of our history, a part of our collective memory. The excavations at Hattusa have taught us a great deal about the Hittites, but there is still so much that we don't know. The city is massive, and only a small portion of it has been excavated. There are still thousands of clay tablets that are waiting to be translated, thousands of stories that are waiting to be told. The Hittite story is not over. It is a story that is still being written, a story that is still being unearthed. And as we continue to dig, as we continue to translate, as we continue to learn, we are not just learning about the Hittites. We are also learning about ourselves. We are learning about our own story, our own history, our own legacy. And that, in a way, is the greatest discovery of all. And so, we come to the end of our story, a long and winding tale of a people who rose from obscurity to build a powerful empire, only to vanish into the mists of time. The Hittites, a people who were once a great power, a civilization that had mastered the art of war and diplomacy, are now a memory, a ghost in the machine of history. Their cities are in ruins, their language is no longer spoken, and their names are just a series of strange sounds in the Bible, a kind of mythical people who lived in a land that no one could quite locate. But their story, a story that was 1,000 years long, is not just a story of a lost world. It is a story of a people who were, in many ways, just like us. They were a people who loved, who hated, who fought, who built, and who dreamed. They were a people who tried to build a world that was stable and just, a world that was a bit more peaceful and a bit more orderly. And for a time, they had succeeded. The collapse of the Hittite Empire was a kind of a forgotten tragedy, a quiet fade into obscurity that was overshadowed by the more dramatic falls of other empires. But the Hittites, who had been so resilient for so long, were not just going to disappear into the dust. Their legacy, a kind of ghost in the machine of history, continued to live on. Their political and legal systems, their religious traditions, and their military tactics were all adopted and adapted by the cultures that came after them. The Hittites were a kind of cultural bridge, a link between the ancient world of Mesopotamia and Egypt and the new world of Greece and Rome. They were a people who had not just lived in history. They had made history, their story, a story that was a long, beautiful, and sometimes tragic epic, is a testament to the power of the human spirit. It is a story that is a reminder that even in the most chaotic of times, It is possible to build something that is beautiful and lasting. The rediscovery of the Hittites was, in a way, a historical miracle. For over 2,000 years, they were a forgotten people, a footnote in the grand tapestry of human history. But with the decipherment of their language, with the excavations of their cities, and with the translation of their stories, they are now a part of our story, a part of our collective memory. Their story is no longer a ghost story. It is a history. And their voice, which was so full of power and so full of beauty, is now a part of our own. It is a voice that reminds us that we are not just a collection of individuals, but a part of a long, unbroken chain of humanity. It is a voice that tells us that our past is not just a historical curiosity. It is a part of who we are. It is a part of our story. A story that is still being written. And as we come to the end of this journey, as we let the final images of the great Hittite Empire fade from our minds, we are left with a quiet sense of wonder. A wonder at the power of a people who could build a kingdom out of nothing. A wonder at the resilience of a culture that could survive for so long. And a wonder at the fragility of a civilization that could disappear so completely. The Hittites are a whisper in the wind, a memory that has faded to a ghost. But their story, their epic story, is now a part of our own. And as you drift off to sleep, let the final images of the great city of Hattusa, with its massive walls and its imposing gates, with its bustling streets and its quiet temples, fade into the darkness. Let the sounds of the chariots, the shouts of the soldiers, and the whispers of the scribes all fade away. And let the final quiet echo of the great Hittite Empire, a whisper from a long-lost world, lull you into a deep and peaceful sleep.